Welcome to the latest episode of MQ's Open Mind. I'm delighted that today we've got a guest who's known very well to me, Professor Helen Minnis, and Craig and I are delighted to welcome Helen to the podcast today. And Helen is Professor of Child Psychiatry at Glasgow here with myself. We're in the same department in mental health and wellbeing. So welcome, Helen, to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Good to see you, Rory. Good to see you, Craig.
Oh, welcome in.
We try to have this as a brief conversation, sort of informal conversation, Helen. So let's begin. I know about a bit, probably don't know as much as I'm going to learn today, but I know some of your history. So what we're really always keen on before we get into the nuts and bolts of the research that you do, and perhaps some of your thoughts around the priorities for mental health research, is get some sense of your journey in mental health research. So maybe where it all began, Helen. So
yeah,
take it over.
Well, I think my interest in mental health came from the fact that my mother was a social worker. She was a social worker in the west of Scotland in Blantyre, which at the time was just the Wild West, to be honest. And she used to talk confidentially about Mrs. X or Mr. Y, and I just found their stories absolutely fascinating, especially with regard to how they, people who were really struggling looked after their children. And it just really developed in me a real fascination with children's minds. But I didn't think I was a scientist. If you'd asked me at medical school who would be the scientist, I wouldn't have been on the list because I didn't think it was kind of curiosity that was the main thing. Mm-hmm. And then I worked in Guatemala.
Hold on, rewind there for a second. Right? So but how did the interest in medicine though? So how did you get to the
interest in medicine? So that was interesting because typical girl back then, I thought I wanted to be a nurse, and my godmother said, "You do realize that girls can be doctors?" And I was like, "Really?"
Okay.
And I was always interested in science, and I was also always interested in people. And I thought science and people really kind of rolled up quite nicely into medicine. I didn't have any doctors or scientists in the family, but I just had a kind of fire in my belly for being a doctor. For some reason. And to be honest, I don't think I would ever have studied at school if I hadn't had a fire in my belly about that. So that's what got me into medicine. But I didn't think I would be a scientist until I got really curious about abused and neglected kids in Guatemala. And I thought the only way that I can actually kind of, I suppose, slake the thirst to find out more is to write myself a research fellowship application, which I did. And I have to say, I probably was halfway through it before I began to realise that I did actually have the kind of attributes for being a scientist. So it was a bit of a surprise to me, to be honest.
Where did you train in medicine first?
I trained in medicine in Glasgow. I never wanted to stay in Glasgow. I think my dad's from the Caribbean. My mum was from Yorkshire. So I always wanted to travel. And because I ended up, Glasgow was the only place that would have me at the time. I did try to get into Queen's and Belfast, and they wouldn't have me.
So how dare they? How very
I know. So I literally left medical school with nothing but a travel bug. That was all I didn't know what my ambitions were other than being a doctor and traveling because I felt really cooped up in Glasgow. So I was away from Glasgow for quite a number of years and just came back to actually train in child psychiatry.
And so when you left medical school, then did you go straight to Guatemala then?
Oh, I did my first year of house jobs.
Yeah.
Probably about 4/5 of the way through that year, my pal Lizzie phoned me up and said, "Have you got a job for next year?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Do you want to go to New Zealand?" And I said, "Yes," without hesitating, because it was going to get me out of Glasgow. So Liz and I went to New Zealand, worked there for a year. But I really wanted to work in a low-income country. I just had a curiosity about working somewhere really, really different from where I'd grown up. So I just kept asking around. And in New Zealand, I actually bumped into a woman who had worked in an orphanage in Guatemala. And she said, they're looking for a doctor. So I just wrote to them. And it was probably about a year before I got a response. And they said, "Yeah, you can come across and be the doctor. We're opening a clinic." So that was how that all happened.
And so how long did you spend in Guatemala?
I spent about 13 months in Guatemala, and then I trained in psychiatry at the Maudsley. And it's quite funny because everyone said that going to Guatemala would be an absolute career disaster. They were like, "Why are you taking time out of medicine?" But I found out later that was what got me into the Maudsley, because everyone going to the Maudsley had stupidly brilliant CVs, which I didn't particularly. And I got really quite pally with the HR manager. And she said, they were just like, "Oh, yes, another PhD from Cambridge, yawn. Another one from Oxford, Oxford, yawn. Oh, She works in an orphanage in Guatemala. She looks interesting. That's what got me in.
Yeah, and then so that's really when you started your journey then in mental health specifically, then the training in psychiatry, and then was the fellowship at the same time then?
No, so I did my core psychiatry training at the Maudsley, and that was a huge stroke of luck for me
Yeah.
because it was such a kind of research-focused clinical training. You know, they were really trying to get you to write and think about research as you're going along. So I started thinking about research, and I wrote a fellowship to get back to Guatemala, and it went to the Wellcome Trust, and the Wellcome Trust said, well, we quite like this idea, but you can't do it in Guatemala. It's never going to work. So it ended up being a randomized controlled trial of foster carer, basically of training of foster carers in Scotland.
Ah, okay. So I never realized that link then. So out of curiosity, why did they think it wouldn't work in Guatemala?
Well, it was actually, when I look back, you know, I knew nothing about research design, and I had what I thought was a great idea of comparing two orphanages, because the question that had come up for me was that at the time, this was in the 90s, in Guatemala, they really believed that you shouldn't talk to children about their difficult previous experiences.
Right.
And, you know, a huge proportion of the children in that orphanage had been street kids. They'd been abused. They'd seen other children being killed. I mean, it was terrible. You know, they had terrible experiences. And I'd come from a culture where children who'd experienced difficult, adverse childhood experiences, they were offered therapy. And I remember at first thinking, you know, they're not offering these children therapy. What, you know, I was probably quite patronizing in my view, in my head. I hope I didn't share those views. And then suddenly I realized that we didn't have any evidence for that in Britain either. You know, this was just a kind of axiom. We just believed that you should therapy children if they'd had difficult experiences. And the Guatemalans thought you should just close it down. And I thought, actually, we don't know who's right. So I had this, I thought, great idea of, in one orphanage, introducing a training for staff about how to talk to children about difficult experiences. And then the other orphanage, not, and comparing the difference. And it was actually Professor Sir Michael Rutter, who was my head of department. And he looked at this proposal and he said, there's a flaw. That's an N of 2. I was like, no, these are huge orphanage. And so he explained that fundamental thing that if you just introduce an intervention into one environment, there could be lots of other reasons why that one changed. So it had to be a randomized control trial. And it took me a while to really believe that it really did. And it did become obvious that that absolutely couldn't have been done in Guatemala at the time. And by that time, I'd met my husband-to-be, and I'd kind of decided maybe I did want to move back to Scotland. And so it ended up being a randomized controlled trial of training for foster carers in Glasgow, well, in the central belt of Scotland.
And then what year was that then, Helen? Did you come back?
So I came back in 96.
96. Oh, okay. And obviously you haven't looked back since.
No. I mean, well, I mean, Glasgow's been great, and I'm so glad I came back to Glasgow.
Well, it's a great city, as we'll both agree, and Craig may not.
One day.
Where are you based, Craig?
I'm in London.
Well, I was in Camberwell for 5 years. I loved it.
Okay.
But I'm glad I live in Glasgow. That's all I can say. No thanks.
Craig
None taken.
Craig just he just bought his first house, so he's in the midst of trying to sort that out at the minute.
Yeah.
So
it's another wonderful city.
Oh, it is. Of course it is.
I must tell you a funny story, because when I was in my Welcome Fellowship interview, you know, it's absolutely terrifying. There's like sort of 12 people there. I can't even remember who was on the panel because it was so terrifying. And these things are terrifying. And someone, you know, number 10 or something, he said, Dr. Minnis, it must have been awful working with those children in Guatemala. And I said, well, to be honest, now I live in Camberwell. And everyone just burst out laughing, and I just thought, oh no, I've just committed the ultimate crime. I've humiliated my interviewer, and I'll definitely not get this fellowship. But apparently it was like 4:30, and they just were delighted at the light relief.
And you got it, so
I did get it.
So it's one you use all the time now, I assume, Helen, is it, to get your...
No, I think it probably was a bit of a risky strategy that just happened to be.
Indeed. So then moving on then, Helen, so tell us about that trial, and because obviously you've done or involved in really innovative work here, and obviously that builds on that early work, I'm assuming. And then, so it'd be great if you tell us a bit about those trials, and obviously two sort of sidelines. You've also got the sort of the RAD work, the sort of reactive attachment work, and obviously that's related to the looked after
Yeah, absolutely.
relations and so on. So can you tell us a bit about, so maybe just start with that first trial and tell us
Yeah.
what you found from that, and then how that's built on the
Yeah.
best trial and the work that obviously you've been
Yeah,
doing.
so that trial, and I mean, you would never do a randomized controlled trial as your PhD these days. I mean, it was a crazy idea because it was before the days where you would do all of the preparatory work and really think about the intervention. And I wouldn't do it the way that I did it then if I were to do it now. In fact, as soon as I'd finished the trial, that was obvious. It was a group training for foster carers. Now I would know not to do a group training because foster carers are really busy people. I would do something one-to-one. It did actually measure attachment disorders. It also measured general mental health problems. So it used the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, which is so commonly used in many trials. It also used an instrument that I had developed for the study. It's now called the RPQ. Back then it was called something different, but it was basically just a short screening instrument for reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder. And actually that was the measure that moved most. So when I looked at that, that final confidence interval graph that you have in a trial, that was almost statistically significant, but not quite. And it's actually that thing, if I'd got another 20 families, we had 182 kids in that trial.
Helen, before you go on, can you say a bit about those who don't know what reactive attachment disorder is?
Yeah, so to be honest, most mental health clinicians don't know what reactive attachment disorder and disinhibited social engagement disorder are. So they are the two so-called attachment disorders. And they are two of the three main disorders in the DSM that are under the trauma and stress-related disorders. So you get post-traumatic stress disorder, reactive attachment disorder, and disinhibited social engagement disorder. And RAD and DSED are the two only disorders that are thought to be specifically caused by abuse and neglect. And nobody's proved that they are yet. That's a task for the future. But no one's ever diagnosed these disorders in the absence of abuse and neglect. And reactive attachment disorder, RAD, is truly a disorder of attachment because the attachment system really is closed down in these children. And they basically either fail to seek or accept comfort, or they do it in a really muted way. So they're very easily missed because typically children, I know you've got kids, Rory, I don't know whether you do, Craig, but if you have children, as soon as your children are upset or got a tummy ache or they're hungry, they will make a lot of noise, and there'll be movement. If they can walk, they'll be running after you going, Mom, Dad. It's a noisy, messy thing. Yeah. Kids with RAD are shut down and muted. And it's hugely problematic because we are actually primed as parents to respond to children. So if they don't give us the signals, then there's nothing to respond to. So these children don't get their developmental needs met. And we often miss them because they just sit quietly. And, you hear stories of kids who've had a history of abuse and neglect who will sit on an abscess, a tooth abscess for 2 weeks and not complain. So it's really a very serious disorder, but very easily missed. Disinhibited social engagement disorder is the other so-called attachment disorder. And it's actually not a disorder of attachment. It's a disorder of social relationships. It's much more similar to something like autism. But these children are indiscriminately friendly. So on the surface of it, look as if they're the opposite from children with RAD. But you can actually get the two disorders in the same child. You can have a child who is, for example, placed in a new adoptive placement, and they're really superficially friendly with the family, and then they realise that they're going and hugging the postman or the primary school teacher. They don't discriminate. They don't care who reads them a story at bedtime. But what the adoptive parents may soon start to realise is that this child actually doesn't go to them specifically for comfort, so that they can't help the child and they can't give the child all that they love that they want to give them. So that's what RAD and DSED are, and they're really quite serious disorders.
Yeah. And how easy is it to distinguish? You mentioned there the overlap with maybe some autistic characteristics.
Yeah.
So is it easy to disentangle or to differentially?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, it is usually pretty easy. And in fact, my colleague, Claire Davidson-Jameson, she's just got her PhD on that very topic. She did some really lovely work. And what she's shown is that most of the time, virtually all of the time, it's actually quite easy to tell the difference, because a child with autism might be quite indiscriminate in their behaviour, but it will be kind of what we would call instrumental. So they might come up to me and say, you've got a red necklace. I've got a red necklace. I like to collect red stones. And you realise it's nothing to do with you. It's about their interest in red stones. a child with disinhibited social engagement disorder would say, oh, I like your red necklace. Did you get that at H&M? Why don't we go down to the shop? So they're trying to get to know you.
Yeah, okay.
Sometimes it's a bit trickier, and Claire, who's a speech and language therapist, has actually found some very clever ways of telling the difference, but most of the time it's actually quite different.
Is this similar to, or I guess, an evolution of like attachment theory?
Yeah, so it's such a good question, Craig, because John Bowlby, who developed attachment theory, he said that he reckoned that we were sort of, in evolutionary terms, we really should be adapted to being hunter-gatherers. And I think that's a really nice way to think about it, because if we were hunter-gatherers walking across the plain with our community and a young infant got lost, basically got left behind, normal attachment theory would get, that infant would shout, they would go, Mom! And people would be like, oh, we've left them behind, and go and get them. A child with reactive attachment disorder would probably get eaten because it wouldn't be noticed. They wouldn't call out. A child with DSED, disinhibited social engagement disorder, might actually go and wander off to another community. So DSED in some ways evolutionarily is kind of quite adaptive. RAD, I can't think of a good evolutionary adaptation to RAD, and I have a horrible feeling that it might be, the community's way of not being able to, if they really can't support the child, they leave them behind. Yeah. That's a horrible thought, but so I think it's helpful to think about it in terms of attachment, and attachment in communities rather than just in mothers and children.
Yeah. So that's really helpful, Helen. So bringing it back then to, that was sort of a sidestep. Let's go back to that after the RCT, or what you did in that RCT, and then bring it up more to the work you're doing now in terms of the trials, and which is obviously helping vulnerable kids.
Yeah, well, so I think there's a little sidestep for a moment, which is that when I worked in the orphanage in Guatemala, and I didn't particularly have a desire to work in an orphanage, I just had a travel bug and ended up there. But because I wanted to get into the Maudsley, I had spoken to Eric Taylor, who he's now retired, but he was a real world expert on ADHD and neurodevelopmental conditions. And it was Eric that suggested that I should think about attachment disorders in the orphanage, because at that time they were just starting to redesign the kind of classification for then the ICD-10. So I arrived in this orphanage in Guatemala with the kind of early descriptions of these disorders, and it was absolutely blindingly obvious that they were real and that they did exist. So when you walked into the orphanage as a stranger, you would just be covered in children, especially under fives. They would just crawl all over you. But I was also the GP for the surrounding villages. So I would go and do like a house call, and the families in the surrounding villages were living in absolute poverty. But the kids in those families would hide behind their mother's skirts, which is what John Bowlby had said that children should do with stranger anxiety. So I came back to Britain absolutely convinced that these things existed. There were no measures. So my first research project as a junior psychiatry trainee was to try and develop a measure, which we then used in that trial. So after that trial, I was faced with the situation that, yes, there were things I would have done differently about the way we'd offered that training.
What was it the trial actually do? What did it actually do?
So the intervention in the trial was actually an intervention that had been used in a low-income country. It had been developed by a child psychiatrist called Naomi Richmond in Mozambique, I think, and it was called Communicating with Children in Difficult Circumstances. So it was basically just a 3-day training aiming to help parents or other carers basically be open to children's communication. So that was back to my original question. Is it better to talk to children about the difficult experiences or not? So the foster carers were randomized to either the intervention, the 3-day training, or services as usual. And I think what that trial made really obvious to me was that there was something in there. There was a signal. I could see that it hadn't quite been significant. And I thought, of course, a 3-day training in the midst of these carers, these families' really complex lives isn't going to be enough. So I started looking around for more in-depth interventions, and I came across a paper, and this was published in 2001 by Charlie Zena. And by this time, I had finished my PhD, I'd got a job in the university, and I got just a 1-week Royal Society of Edinburgh Fellowship to go and visit New Orleans and observe. This was in 2004, observe this intervention. And what they were doing was intervening with the birth family. So they were intervening with the birth family of children under the age of 5, so babies or young children who were in foster care. And then what they would try to do was to offer evidence-based, relationship-focused treatments to the birth family to try and get the birth family to shift in their caregiving enough to have the child home.
Yeah.
And I mean, it takes time to do research, but I literally went and observed that intervention in 2004, and we literally submitted the final report on that study 3 weeks ago. And I can't say what we found because it's not published yet.
Of course. But that became the best trial.
It became the best services trial, and it took years. It took me 2 goes to persuade Charlie Zena and Julie LaRue, who developed that intervention, to come to Glasgow. Like, why would they come to Glasgow? Eventually they came. I got them to do a big lecture, and I got them to do a kind of policy seminar. And in the policy seminar was Matt Ford, who's now the head of partnerships and programs at NSPCC. But at the time, he was the head of the West Glasgow Health and Social Care Partnership. And he came up to me and he said, I want that intervention in West Glasgow. And so we tried to get it into West Glasgow. You can imagine lots of hurdles. We got the head of childcare social work involved at the time, Suzanne Miller. She became a co-investigator. And then Matt moved to NSPCC. So it became a partnership with NSPCC. But it took years to get the trial off the ground. And then we had a CSO-funded feasibility trial. We then had a bridging period funded by NSPCC. We then got NIHR funding. And then I don't know if you know the story of this, but we actually had the trial stopped for 2 years by the English judiciary.
Well, I knew there were challenges. But...
Yeah, but it was a very, very long trial, and that was why, because it was such a difficult trial to deliver. But the amazing thing about it is that the English judiciary have now embraced the trial, and they are now really keen on randomised controlled trials in the judiciary. So,
and what was the rationale? What was their objection?
It was really interesting. It was absolutely not their fault. Somebody in London, I found out later, who was kind of fairly peripherally involved with the study, had been going around saying, oh, we've got this wonderful New Orleans intervention. And quite rightly, the judge in East London said, well, if it's that wonderful, then how can it possibly be ethical to randomise Mrs. A to that and Mrs. B to that?
Yeah.
She told her boss, who was the head of the family division of the High Court, and he said, yeah, you're right. And eventually Matt Ford and I went to talk to him, and we explained that the reason we wanted to do the study was because we didn't know the answer. And, my mother was a social worker, so I could quite honestly, hand on heart, say social work might be better. And since he knew that we really believed that and we didn't know the answer, he said, actually, this randomization thing might be quite a good thing. And they became huge advocates.
It's a principle for science as well, isn't it?
It's absolutely.
Yeah. And so when will we? I know you just submitted the report 3 weeks ago, and I obviously saw you in the dying days of getting that all finalized. These things are always challenging. So when will we know the results, or when will that be?
Well, we'll see. I mean, we've submitted the main outcomes paper to a good journal, and it's gone out to review.
So we're just waiting.
We have to wait and see as soon as possible. We got that paper submitted mid-March, so.
So fingers crossed. Okay, so then what's next then, Helen? Maybe you can't. Well,
no,
I know you're involved with different things. But you can't say. I suppose you can't really say what's going to happen with.
Well, no, I mean,
lead off with the best trial yet.
Well, a couple of things have already. A couple of other things that come out of this work. One is a trial that follows directly on from the best trial, and although it's not based on the findings, all the way through that trial, stakeholders, particularly social workers and foster families, kept saying, "Why don't you intervene before these children are abused and neglected in the first place?" And we would say that's another trial. Yeah. So we've been doing a feasibility randomized controlled trial called Partnership for Change. And it's trying to do exactly that. So the teams, the infant and family teams that we were trialing in the best services trial were basically co-producing with parents an upstream version of those called infant parent support, aimed at family, basically aiming to support families so that they don't have to, they don't end up abusing and neglecting their children. So that was funded by Foundations What Works, which is a specific funder for focusing on struggling families. And we've got an application in for a definitive trial for that. So we're crossing fingers and that we can continue into the definitive phase for that. So that's grown directly out of BEST, actually. It's been really exciting because it's involving families who themselves have had children in the social care system co-producing the intervention. Actually, we spoke, me and Sharon Graham, who's the lead for the parent collaborators. We actually spoke at an MQ conference last year about that, about the whole process of co-production. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is a trial of dyadic developmental psychotherapy. So that's called the Relationships in Good Hands trial. And again, that was actually a study that the idea for that study again came up during my PhD, because at that time there was huge controversy about interventions that at the time were called attachment therapies, and some of them are frankly dangerous. So there was a group of therapies, a very broad kind of mixed bag of therapies, but at the extreme end, there were therapists in the States that were doing things like wrapping children in blankets, and there was a child who died, trying to kind of rebirth them and all sorts, some really crazy things. But at the less extreme end, there was some really, what I thought was really interesting work, and I actually went out and observed a clinic. And the most sensible of those interventions is a treatment called dyadic developmental psychotherapy. And it took years to get that trial off the ground because it was so controversial, because it was seen as a part of that bag where there was some craziness in it.
Yeah.
So
that's up and running now, though, is it?
It's up and running, halfway through recruitment. So hopefully we'll be able to get that finished. It seems to be going pretty well. It's got 17 sites across the UK, so it's Scottish, English, and Welsh sites. It's really exciting. So
watch the space. Just, when you mentioned MQ there, obviously you're involved, you're involved in the Bridge project.
Yes.
So it's obviously Rashika, our colleague Rashika, is leading on that.
Yeah.
So do you want to say a bit about
Yes.
That was a couple of years ago that funding started, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it goes to the end of this year, and I think it will continue. I mean, Ruchika's done an amazing job of pulling in various different partners into that study, and it really links to this. When Ruchika joined our team, which is about 10 years ago now, she was very focused on the kind of adolescent into adult interface, and that felt like a really nice balance, because I was focusing more on the infant end. But those are the two really interesting parts of development, I think, for child development. It's that early kind of 0 to 2 age, and then it's adolescence. And together we came up with this, we did some quite basic research looking at showing that children who've been abused and neglected are at much higher risk of also having neurodevelopmental conditions. And to our great surprise, the abuse and neglect doesn't seem to cause the neurodevelopmental conditions. And our team's done a lot of work since, just trying to understand this kind of complex interplay between conditions like ADHD, autism, intellectual disabilities, tic disorders, and abuse and neglect. And we think that it's a bi-directional relationship. Let's put that, a complex, multi-directional relationship. But clearly, children who've got developmental disabilities are at higher risk of being abused and neglected. We've known that for decades, and we think that's probably because they're harder to look after. Mm-hmm. So Ruchika's interest has been in borderline personality disorder, and what her work has shown that young people with borderline personality disorder have an overwhelmingly high prevalence of neurodevelopmental conditions, often undiagnosed. And I think we've begun to realise more and more that a lot of these young people have actually had many, many missed opportunities for intervention over the years. So we're both really interested in how do you actually help young people with these complex presentations access services.
Yeah.
So what Bridge is about, and it's such an innovative study, I think, it's called Bridge because it's about providing a bridge between all the different parts of the young person's network. And Ruchika has managed to recruit young people through youth clubs, school youth counsellors, lots of other third sector organisations, and also through child and adolescent mental health services and adult mental health services. And what they get if they're randomised to Bridge is they get a really detailed, holistic assessment and formulation, and it uses a cognitive analytic framework to do the formulation, with the idea that the young person should be able to actually take that on and understand themselves, understand the make and model in a way that they can explain it to other people, and the other people can understand them better, and that can be their family.
Makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's just really sensible, good practice. I think Ruchika's done an amazing job of kind of linking up all of these different aspects of the community, and realising that the problem for these kids is they've fallen between the cracks.
Within the next 12 months, we'll know whether good news or bad news with regard to that work.
Exactly. Oh, I mean, I think we just both feel there has to be a way of continuing it. I mean, there's various health boards really interested in this work. So I think by hook or by crook, we'll get to the definitive stage.
Good. But just on coming to my head there, Helen, when you were chatting then about the relationship, obviously, between trauma or the nature of the relationship between trauma and presentation with other neurodevelopmental challenges. But just to remind me, you published a really interesting paper in Nature Mental Health. Last month, was it May and March?
Yeah, February. Yep.
February. Well, recently. We'll agree it's recently. I think it came out in March, though, because I'm looking at it now.
Oh, well, in that case, it's March.
So I think it was accepted. It was accepted in February. Oh no, it was accepted in February. Maybe no. I think you're right. Actually, this February came up first. I thought it's March. So we won't challenge the date. I'm not really fascinating because what you're proposing is a new sort of framework to help us understand the relationship between adversity and negative outcomes across the lifespan.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so it started with a chance encounter. So I became a professor at the same time as Professor Paul Shields. Now, Professor Paul Shields is a geneticist, an epigeneticist, and he would call himself a geroscientist. So his focus is on aging. And we were both getting inducted into senates, and Paul came up to me and said, "You're a child psychiatrist and you're interested in abuse and neglect, am I right?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I would like to understand aging in the under fives." Now, I nearly fell over. And I thought, I've never been asked such an interesting question. But there's all of this absolutely fascinating research across species, actually, showing that if somebody, or if a being, because we could be talking about horses or earthworms, if they experience extreme stress, then their lifespan speeds up. You get this accelerated lifespan. And what it means in humans is people who've been abused and neglected, girls and boys actually tend to have puberty earlier. They tend to have faster brain development. And one of the fascinating things working with Paul, for me, has been that we know that in middle age, that's bad for you. So he's done some really interesting work with the MRC Social and Public Health Sciences Unit, showing that the telomeres, which is the kind of alarm clock at the end of your DNA that shortens and shortens and shortens across the life, and when it shortens completely, you're dead. Really is an alarm clock. Telomere shortening is faster in middle-aged people who live in very stressful environments. We know that it's not a good thing in adults. We don't know that it's not a good thing in children. And what I've noticed clinically is that kids who've experienced adversity are often really savvy, really entrepreneurial, and also you can reverse a lot of these changes. So we've just had this really open-minded attitude, and what it's done is it's brought together a group of really disparate scientists. So I've been working with Rebecca Reynolds, who's an endocrinologist in Edinburgh, Emily Comby, who's a nutritionist and biochemist and works on the microbiome. And the more we talk together, and neuroscientists as well, we realise that none of us have got the answers, and what we really need to do is to try and find ways of measuring all of these things in young people, boiling all the data down to work out what are the few things that can really predict outcome. And if we can do that, we might actually be able to work out why some people who've developed adversity have really poor outcomes, while others actually don't have poor outcomes at all. So I guess what we're really trying to argue is that you've really got to look across all of the systems if you're going to be able to understand this. We need to break down the silos in science to do that.
Yeah, and you call it the bioexposome.
Yeah, I know. So basically, this idea of the exposome came from cancer scientists. They were saying we've got to measure everything in the environment as well as we measure our biology.
Yeah.
So they talked about, everyone got excited about the exposome.
Yeah.
But you had exposome scientists and you had biologists. And what we're seeing is we've got to cut down, we've got to break down that barrier as well.
Yeah.
And the example that I always give is if you've got a child who is, for example, a hyper responder in terms of their stress responses. So we know that there are hyper responders and hypo responders. If you've been abused and neglected, if you're a hyper responder in a classroom, you're probably going to throw chairs and lose your temper. If you're a hypo responder, you're probably going to kind of shut down.
Yeah.
You're going to have a very different environment depending on whether you're a hyper or hypo responder. So the environment's going to bite you back, in other words. So it's really just to try and get across that you've got to think about all of these things at the same time.
I suppose if you think about ADHD, I mean, it's a classic example of how you interacting with your environment and the environment's responding to you. Your experience will be very, very different, very different indeed. Exactly. But actually, that brings me back then to, so let's think of, because we're coming sort of towards last, whatever, 10 or so minutes of the podcast. I'm trying to think of some sort of key take homes, Helen, from your work. So we always ask everybody this question as well is, so before we get to take homes, so if you had sort of all the money in the world type thing, what would you prioritize? What do you think is a big question we should be trying to answer? Maybe in your case, obviously, with infant mental health.
What would I ask? I would ask, how can we best support parents so that children don't get abused and neglected in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
And actually, that's a huge question. Yeah. And it would really require a big program of research. Because
a huge government intervention.
Well, once you got the answers, but I don't think we know the answer to that question. I think all of the research that I've done has really shown me, and it's really got me to a point where I think we've got to stop blaming parents for children's problems. Because actually, virtually every child, every parent, even if they are actually abusing and neglecting their child, 99.99999% of them are trying to do their best. Some of them are mucking up. So how can we change that? We need to get in much earlier. We need to understand about how villages support a child, because I really think in the West we've forgotten that it takes a village to raise a child. What is the role of aunties and grandparents? What's the role of alloparents, as the evolutionary biologists call them, in supporting parents to support children?
Yeah.
How do we support parents whose child is more difficult to look after than other children? And that's something I think we really now do understand. And that's one of the reasons we wrote that bioexposome paper, is because actually all of those areas of science show that no two children are the same. And what that means is that some children are easy to look after. Some children are really difficult to look after. Yeah. And those parents will be tearing their hair out, but that's a symptom rather than a cause. And we need to be supporting those parents. How do we identify those parents? How do we reduce the stigma? How do we develop services so they can walk through the door? It's a huge area of research, but that's what I would put money on.
No, that's a great suggestion. You say pretty vast, and once we get the answer to those questions. But I do think there's a bit of, even before we know the answer, one of the things I've been saying really frustrates me is over the last 14 years in the United Kingdom, all we've done is take away support from early years. And so we know if you put more support in early on, of course, it's going to protect and help those parents and help those crucial 100%. Periods. So I think hopefully
100%. I mean, I don't know if you saw, I co-chaired a report by the Academy of Medical Sciences recently, and
that's right, yeah.
It was so fantastic that they thought that was a kind of important area of science, because we are really building up problems for the future. They found research that shows that if we don't focus on the health of the under fives, we're probably going to be costing ourselves about 16 billion a year. And you're so right. And it really upsets me that we live in a country where children routinely now are going to bed hungry.
Yeah.
It's absolute craziness. And that is going to bite all of us back. It really is.
The latest statistics is that 20% of the population came out, I think, last month or this month even, pretty recently anyway, about 20% of the population are living in poverty.
Deep poverty, yeah.
Deep poverty. And I can't remember that we translate down to absolute numbers of kids.
Yeah.
It's thousands upon thousands upon thousands.
Yeah.
And we're allegedly the 6th wealthiest country in the world.
Shame on us. Shame on us.
It's a moral outrage is what it is. That brings me on sort of maybe just before we do the takeaways is on diversity, actually. We'll have a bit on diversity. And Helen, you have obviously led the way. The first Black professor of child psychiatry, or yeah.
I mean, it was really bizarre
in the UK.
It could be worldwide. I have no idea. I wouldn't be surprised.
It's definitely in the UK. I know I've heard you say this before.
What really surprised me was that when I became a professor, I had no idea until I became a professor that I was the 18th Black woman professor in any subject in the UK, and there was like 10,000 professors.
Unbelievable.
I mean, crazy. I think there's something like 36 now. So I had no idea until then that I was so unusual. I think part of that's growing up in Scotland, because I think in Scotland I was very lucky, because there were very few Black people and there were mostly people's doctors or whatever. So people just assumed I was going to be clever. Rather than I think in many parts of the world, there's really low expectations if you're Black. So I've been really lucky not to have that. And I think that's huge. And I mean, on the whole, I think it sounds crazy, but I think it's been an advantage as a scientist. I was asked about 8 years ago to do a talk for young Black scientists. It was mainly physicists, actually. It was an amazing young postdoc at Imperial had this conference, and she was really struggling to find Black sort of seniors. And my son at the time had become really interested in philosophy.
Yeah.
And so you don't do philosophy when you're a medic, so he was explaining some really interesting philosophical things that really helped me understand how being a Black scientist, I think, makes you a better scientist. So one of them is double consciousness. And this was a theory that W.E.B. Du Bois came up with in like 1880s in the States, and basically said if you're a Black person in the States, you will constantly be having to think about how you see yourself, and it will be at odds with the way people see you.
Mm-hmm.
And that is so true. And what it means is, especially you notice it as you get more senior, there are certain people, not everyone, but there are certain people who you just can see saying to themselves, really? You?
Mm-hmm.
And so what that does is you get questioned a lot more. I think you do just get questioned a lot more. But of course, as a scientist, you need to be questioned a lot. So actually, I think that hones your skills. Then there's something called the master-slave dialectic, and that was fascinating. And this was Hegel. And he said you can get into an argument to the death with someone about who's on top of the argument. And I found that incredibly helpful because my son was describing this to me, and I realized a couple of weeks before, I'd been in a room with 2 other scientists and 3 project managers. And this white male scientist, lovely guy, really lovely guy, had basically kind of said, I don't agree with you about something. So we'd had a nice wee debate, quite enjoyable little debate. I suddenly noticed that everyone was watching him and hanging on to his every word. And I realised that I was 15 years his senior and this was my topic of expertise. I thought, I'm probably right, but hey. So what happens in the master-slave dialectic apparently is the person who comes down at the bottom, who loses the argument, actually ends up coming out on top because you run around looking for evidence to feed the master. So I kept asking all these statisticians, and eventually this top statistician said to me, Helen, you are correct. And I just lifted the paragraph and put it into the grant application. So something about being a Black scientist, it just makes you really robust to critique, I think.
Mm-hmm. And a positive example, but I mean, that's not everybody's experience. I mean, there's lots of racism and inequality and discrimination still there.
Well, I think that is probably everybody's experience. I think a lot of people fall out. So that constant critique, you've got to be in a very supportive environment, or you'll just think, well, it's me, I'm crap. And you'll just, I think a lot of young Black scientists leave the pipeline. And I really noticed that at that day at Imperial. There was a young Black PhD student, and he said, oh, you see, I'm not really very good at maths. And I was like, wait a minute, did you hear what you just said? You're doing a PhD in physics at Imperial College London. Therefore, you are one of the top in maths in the world. Fact. And so if you've got Black people constantly questioning themselves, because everyone's questioning them, you're going to lose a lot of those scientists along the way.
So what else can we do, or should we be doing to foster more diversity?
Yeah, well, I think this kind of conversation is so refreshing. This is the second podcast in the last 2 years where I've been asked about this. I've never been asked about it before. It's great. This is the kind of conversation that we need. Young Black scientists, young Black clinicians as well, they need to understand that when they doubt themselves, it might be because they're getting extra critique. So they've got to keep going. They need to see people like me. They need to see people like Ruchika. You follow what you see, you become what you see. So that's really important. I think we also need to accept in science that diversity is crucial if we want to do good science. So there's a fantastic book called The Power of Giving Away Power by a guy called Matthew Barzun. I think I've recommended this to you about this in the past. Yeah. But he was an advisor to Barack Obama. He talks about how it's so important to have cognitive diversity as well as ethnic or gender diversity. Essentially, you need people with different backgrounds, different experiences, different ways of thinking in teams, or you're never going to get interesting questions asked.
I think we do. Well, I think we are moving. I would like to think anyway, hopefully I'm not being naive, but I think we are moving in the right direction, but we've still a a long road ahead. So no, but thanks for everything you do and being shining a light on these issues, Helen, and also just being an incredible role model. And I obviously know, working with you closely, how remarkable a role model you are. So,
I can see that.
so Helen, then let's just bring it back with two last things before we finish, right? Maybe two take homes. If somebody could only learn or remember one thing from what you said from the work that you're doing, right? Either on the sort of understanding attachment and consequences of attachment and attachment disorders, or how we intervene, what do you say that's two key take homes?
So I would say attachment disorders, especially reactive attachment disorder, is treatable. So let's identify it and treat it. And that means watching for the quiet children.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that maltreated children are more likely to have neurodevelopmental conditions. So clinicians need to be taking a both-and approach, and they need to be much more supportive of parents and realise that these kids might just be hard to look after.
Two nice, brilliant nuggets of wisdom and advice. Okay, Helen, we always end the podcast with two, if we can squeeze them in. So I'm going to try and squeeze these in. Two quick questions, which are unrelated to your research specifically. But the first one is, reflecting, you've been around a bit longer than 16 years on this planet.
Yeah.
But if you could reflect back and say, what advice would you give your 16-year-old self? What would that be?
Wow, yeah. Just keep going. Life will get better.
Yeah, succinct, yeah.
Yep.
I say those awful adolescent periods.
Yeah, I remember my mum said when I was 15, she said 16's terrible. And I was like, 15's great. 16's terrible.
I think I much prefer 16 than 15, actually.
Maybe you have to be a girl, you know.
Okay, maybe.
But
Maybe. And then the last question, Helen, is if you could have a dinner or coffee with one person, living or dead, famous or not famous, who you haven't had dinner or coffee with previously, who would be top of your list?
James Baldwin. Without, definitely.
Why?
What a fascinating man. Gay and black, and the most tremendous writer, you know, just did literary wonders, such insights. And I just would love to talk to him. I
think that was the quickest response we've ever had to that question, Craig.
It was.
Literally usually a bit of a delay. It's like, that was like a millisecond, and James Baldwin's out there. Brilliant, excellent. That's another great suggestion. Okay, Helen, on behalf of Craig, and I thanks so much, well, for all the work that you do and will continue to do, but for joining us today and sharing your experiences and your knowledge and wisdom and good humour. So thanks so much.
Oh, well, thanks for asking such great questions. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you, and goodbye, everybody.
Bye for now.